Monumental levels of stupid, as this government is now preparing emergency plans because of the influx of private school children that are having to leave the private school sector to state schools because they haven't accounted for how many children are going to have to make the move. Now, the initial government estimates, now you'll obviously think about the initial government estimates being what they are, estimates by the government, perhaps not taking into account the full extent of the impact that this is likely to have, are already in the thousands in the initial influx and many tens of thousands over the medium to long term. So welcome back to the channel. I hope you've had a nice Christmas, but for many people the nice Christmas bit hasn't really lasted very long because come 1st of January many children are going to have to make the move to a school or are going to be without a school at all because there are no state school places available for them. Now, I find it absolutely preposterous that the government is having to make emergency plans to respond to a policy that it created, which is absolutely divisive and frankly somewhat evil, to target children to essentially force them to make the move. Now, there is a legal case being brought by way of judicial review on the basis that it is a protected human right, the right to education, and that this policy may be discriminatory in that it disproportionately affects and therefore discriminates against many different children. Particularly, by way of example, there will be children with special education needs and children of faith schools, which obviously will be disproportionately affected because the entire school will be affected if they go to one of those schools. And not only are there estimates of how many children might have to move, but what they haven't accounted for and can't possibly have accounted for, in my personal view, is how many of those schools will be forced into closure. Now, some of those schools will try to adjust their pricing accordingly so that the fees are not passed on in full to parents, which will have a massive hit on the school, which long term it may threaten the survival of the school. Many of them, of course, have no choice but to pass on the full costs, which are in the thousands per term. So you're looking at, £5,000, £10,000, £15,000 per year that people just simply don't have. However elitist some people think private schools are. The vast majority of private schools are simply not elitist in that sense. They are just people working very hard to give their children an alternative education that they so choose. And that's where it comes in with this judicial review claim. Now, the Chancellor has a chance to respond to this claim in the way that any other claim they would. That will then likely lead to a judicial review hearing hopefully early next year. But again, back to how many of these schools may end up closing. Now, obviously, if a school closes, it's not just a few hundred or whatever children that have to leave those schools, but every child at that school will have to move somewhere else. And where are they going to go? Because I know for a fact that many, many hundreds, if not thousands of people have left comments and written in to confirm to me that they've been ringing around their local schools. They've been speaking to local authorities. The local authority has said speak to the school. The school have said we've got no places, find another school or speak to the local authority, and they've gone round in circles. And some places, such as Surrey and Woking, have got 0 places available in years 9, 10 and 11, and I dare say this is probably the case around the country, but many places have just not confirmed as much. But, as I say, if some of these schools close, then the whole school worth of children are going to have to find somewhere else to go. And that's just not possible. Now, above the fold, in a scathing article by The Times, it says, if there were an award for the minister presiding over the most wrong-headed policy agenda, it would surely go to Bridget Phillipson, despite some of the competitive performances from her colleagues. Just 6 months into the role, the Education Secretary's end-of-term report card is an alarming record of unforced errors with warning signals of worse to come. This is, of course, referring to other things such as shifting funding that was otherwise aimed at free schools and other areas such as shifting the focus of the curriculum from things such as museum visits and replacing it with workshops on graffiti. Make of that what you will. I find that a little bit odd, frankly. Now, just to drive home the impact and the risk to these schools is twofold. One of which, the speed with which this policy is being brought in, which will play into the judicial review claim, which I'll come back to in a moment, and the fact that this government simply cannot understand, even if it really wanted to, simply cannot understand the budgeting and the commercial running of those schools. Because it simply won't have access to the books and the financing and the commercial management of the school, and And even if it did, they won't be able to do that for all of them, and they've got no jurisdiction to do so. So they are putting them at risk without being able to ascertain what commercial risk there is to that school. And also the budgeting for these schools is done in advance, not just 1 or 2 months before new policies come in and hit them with 20%, but typically the previous summer. So they will plan for the following year, because obviously an academic year and everything else, they've got lots of things to prepare for. They would have made their plans and their budgets and everything else long before this policy was really coming into any likelihood of coming into being. Now, not only that, coming in halfway through the year and with the amount of schools hitting the government with registration applications for VAT, and many people reporting that they just simply don't have a VAT number, and thus they are struggling to even account for the VAT in the first place. This is all recipe for disaster. Not to mention that bringing this in halfway through a term is obviously disruptive to the school in the way it provides for those children, but also the children that have to move because it's come in halfway through the term. So as I say, for a government to have to bring in emergency plans to deal with the fallout of a policy that it created to rush through at record speed is frankly ludicrous and screams to me personally a government that has no clue what it's doing. Now, just to round off what I'm saying and to address some of those that don't like the quote-unquote political content and think that this should only be about law exclusively, this is about the law, because this is very much a legal policy that they are required now to pay VAT, and there are legal aspects to it because there's this pending judicial review on the basis that it might be discriminatory and therefore unlawful. If that were to be successful, by the way, the court might make a ruling that this new policy is incompatible with the Human Rights Act, which gives rise to the European Convention on Human Rights and all of the rights therein. And that includes the right to education. And that is that the government cannot take steps to implement law and policy that infringes on that right. So when the government imposes laws such as these, they don't just have a direct effect on a certain group of people, but they have an effect on everybody throughout the country, whether that is direct or indirect. And those policies may well be unlawful, and they are open to challenge. And so it is things like this that I feel necessary to talk about on this channel, because some of these legal implications have a massive effect on people, not just in the sense of getting out of a parking ticket or challenging someone that hasn't paid your invoice or anything of that nature, but these have a very real effect on lots of people around the country. And it is an alarming number of people that will directly suffer as a result of this policy and indirectly suffer as a result of this policy. And that is, of course, worth being held to account. But the most ridiculous thing is if this government is having to draw up emergency plans to deal with the fallout of its own policy. So if you've been affected or you're worried about this policy, do let me know your story and send me some documents confidentially, of course, and I won't repeat any names on here, to contact@BlackBeltBarrister.com. I'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, please do like the video and subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.